The storm prowled across the plains like a wounded beast, its growls echoing through the darkening sky. Thunder rolled over distant hills, chasing streaks of lightning that split the clouds in crooked veins of white-blue. The wind carried dust, the scent of wet earth and the chill of something deeper, something inside her. Amelia sat on the ranch's weathered wooden porch, her back pressed against one of the thick beams that held up the creaking roof. The boards beneath her were damp from the rain, and her worn boots were speckled with mud.
She didn't shiver from the cold.
She shivered because inside her chest there was a hollow so vast, nothing could warm it. She kept her eyes on the horizon, though there was nothing to see but darkness and the ghostly outline of the mountains beyond the fields. Her hands were clasped together in her lap, trembling. Her hair, once brushed smooth by her mother's hands years ago, was tangled now, damp and sticking to her cheeks. Her clothes were faded, threadbare in places. The rain had soaked through the sleeves of her blouse, and her skin was cold beneath it. Behind her, footsteps softened by the storm approached across the porch boards. She felt them before she heard them, slow, steady. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who never rushed, who carried the weight of responsibility like a second coat. Elijah. He didn't speak, not at first. He stood a few feet away, his silhouette barely visible in the light that spilled from the lantern hanging inside the kitchen door. The storm crackled, the thunder rumbled, and still he said nothing. It wasn't silence that made Amelia uneasy. It was kindness. She was used to silence that pressed, that judged, that belittled. Elijah's silence was different. It waited. Finally, her voice broke through it, barely louder than the wind. "I'm not worth anything," she whispered. The words slipped out of her like a confession she'd been holding on to for far too long. They trembled in the air, fragile as a bird's wing. Elijah took another step. The boards creaked under his weight. His coat was soaked from the rain, darkened and heavy, but his eyes, warm brown, steady like the earth, held no pity, only quiet strength. He stopped next to her, crouched down, and without asking, without hesitation, took her cold, trembling hand into his calloused one. His touch was warm, solid, real. Amelia flinched, instinctively pulling back a little. Not because she feared him, but because the gesture broke something inside her. A barrier she had built from years of harsh voices and closed doors. She had forgotten what gentle felt like. He didn't tighten his grip, didn't force her to stay. His hand rested over hers lightly, like he was holding a bird that might fly away if he squeezed too hard. His face softened into a small smile, not wide, not bright, but enough to say, "You're not alone." The wind whipped around them, sending rain sideways across the porch. Elijah glanced at her soaked sleeves, the way she clutched herself as though trying to stay together. He slid his coat from his shoulders and, without ceremony, wrapped it around her. It was rough wool, heavy, and it smelled faintly of pine and horses. She blinked, stunned. "You'll catch your death sitting like this," he murmured, voice low and calm, barely louder than the rain. Amelia swallowed, her throat burning. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice cracking. It wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Elijah looked out at the fields, at the cattle huddled near the barn, their silhouettes barely visible through sheets of rain. "Because out here," he said, turning back to her, "every soul matters, especially yours." She didn't know what to say. She had no words for kindness she didn't deserve. In her mind she saw flashes, her father's back as he walked away, her mother's tired eyes turning cold, the door closing as she stood outside in the rain, just like this one. She'd been told she was a burden, a mistake, a weight dragging everyone down, worthless. So she had started to believe it. Amelia pulled her knees to her chest under his coat, resting her chin on them. Rain dripped from the edge of the porch roof, forming tiny rivers that splashed down into the muddy ground below. She watched the ripples, her breath misting in the cold air. "You shouldn't waste your time on me," she murmured. "You don't even know me." Elijah didn't answer right away. He sat down beside her, his boots thudding softly against the boards. The lantern light flickered, catching in his dark hair, tracing the tired lines of his face, lines worn not by despair, but by resilience. "I don't need to know everything about you to see you're hurting," he said at last, "and I don't need to know your past to know you deserve a chance at peace." She turned her head slightly, studying him. His face was calm, but his eyes held a world of stories. Loss, maybe. Hard winters. Long nights alone. But also hope. The kind of hope born not from naivety, but from choosing to keep going. A gust of wind sent the porch lantern swaying, casting wild shadows. Lightning flashed, illuminating the barn, the fence posts, the endless stretch of land that belonged to no one and everyone. Amelia's voice came out in a whisper so soft it almost vanished in the storm. Peace doesn't belong to people like me. Elijah's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. Then stay until you believe it does, she frowned. Stay? He nodded. There's a spare room at the end of the hall. It ain't much, just a bed, a dresser. But it's warm, dry. He hesitated. Safe. She looked down at her hand, still cradled beneath his. No one had offered her safety without asking for something in return. No one had offered it freely. She waited for the condition, for the price. But it never came. Thunder rolled. Closer this time. The rain came harder, pounding against the roof. Elijah stood slowly and held out his hand to her, rain dripping from his fingertips. Come inside, Amelia. He said her name like it mattered. She hesitated. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The porch, the storm, the cold, all of it suddenly felt like the edge of a cliff. If she stepped inside, if she took his hand, everything might change. Maybe it would hurt more. Maybe it would hurt less. She reached out. Her fingers brushed his palm. He closed his hand around hers, not tight, not possessive, just steady. She rose to her feet. Her legs trembled, her breath uneven. Elijah didn't speak. He just guided her toward the door, his coat still around her shoulders. The lantern light spilled over them both, warm against the cold storm. Inside, the air smelled of firewood, fresh bread, and saddle leather. The hearth crackled softly in the main room, casting a glow that made the shadows dance. Amelia stepped over the threshold like someone entering a dream she wasn't sure she was allowed to see. Elijah gently closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind and rain. He hung his hat on the hook by the wall and glanced at her, water still dripping from his hair. Sit by the fire, he said quietly. I'll get a blanket. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked toward the fire. The heat kissed her cold cheeks, and she crouched near the flames, holding out her hands. They were red from the cold, knuckles white from being clenched too long. Elijah returned with a thick wool blanket and draped it around her shoulders. She didn't thank him, not because she wasn't grateful, but because her voice was trapped in her chest. Tangled with tears she refused to shed. He moved to the kitchen, lit another lantern, and set about brewing coffee in an iron pot over the stove. The storm outside battered the walls, but inside there was warmth. Not the warmth of comfort, she wasn't ready for that, but the warmth of possibility. After a few minutes, Elijah poured her a cup and handed it to her. The mug was chipped around the rim, but the heat seeped through her fingers, warming her from the outside in. She took a small sip. It was strong, bitter, but real. They sat in silence for a while. Elijah in the wooden chair across from the fire, Amelia on the rug beside it. The crackle of the fire, the soft clink of rain against the window, and the low hum of the storm became a symphony of quiet understanding. Finally, Elijah spoke. You don't have to tell me anything tonight, he said softly. Or ever. But just know you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. Not while you're under this roof. Amelia stared into the flames. Her reflection flickered in the glass of the hearth. Eyes tired, cheeks pale, hair damp. She didn't recognize herself. She wasn't sure she wanted to, but when she glanced up at Elijah sitting quietly, hands wrapped around his own mug, something inside her loosened. Just a little. Why are you doing this? She asked. You don't even know who I am. What if I bring trouble? What if I don't deserve it? Elijah met her gaze. His voice was firm but gentle. Everyone deserves a chance to rest, even if they don't believe it yet. She looked down at her hands. Tears blurred her vision and she wiped them away quickly, almost angrily. She didn't want him to see her cry. Crying had never fixed anything before. Elijah stood and moved toward the hallway. There's a room ready for you, he said. If you want it. She stayed by the fire for a long moment after he disappeared down the hall. The room was silent but alive. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the whispering fire, the lingering echo of his words. Rest, safety, a place to belong. She didn't know if she could believe in those things. Not yet, but she stood, clutching the blanket, and walked down the hallway. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her feet. She found the room at the end, a small bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser, a window overlooking the storm-soaked fields. She stepped inside. For a long moment she just stood there, one hand still on the doorframe. Thunder rolled across the sky. In the faint glow from the lamp she held, the room looked unreal, like a memory she might lose if she blinked. She set the lamp on the nightstand and sank onto the bed. The mattress was soft, the quilt warm. Rain whispered against the window. The storm was still raging, but for the first time in a very long time it was outside. Amelia pulled the quilt around herself, her fingers clutching the fabric. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, not from despair but from something else. Something quieter. Something like hope, though she wouldn't dare name it. Down the hall she heard Elijah's footsteps fade into his room. A door closed softly. The house settled into the night. She didn't whisper it this time, didn't speak at all. But in her heart, those words still lingered. I'm not worth anything yet. In the warmth of the quilt and the echo of Elijah's steady voice. Another thought emerged, small, fragile, but alive. What if I am? And though she did not know it yet, though she could not see the sunrise waiting beyond the storm, this was the moment. Everything began to change. The storm that had shaken the night finally began to soften by dawn. The gray clouds lingered in the sky like tired travelers, heavy with the memory of the rain they had released. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and a thin mist curled along the edges of the fields, touching the tall grasses as though whispering secrets to them. The world felt quiet, almost fragile, as though it was holding its breath. Amelia woke to the soft crackling of a fire somewhere down the hall and the distant clinking of metal against metal. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The quilt wrapped around her was warm, and the mattress beneath her back was softer than any bed she had laid upon in months, maybe years. Her heart raced. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. Then she remembered. The storm. The porch, Elijah. She sat up slowly. The lamplight from the night had faded, replaced by the pale early light of morning filtering through thin curtains. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, still a little tangled from the rain. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She hesitated before walking toward the door. The house was quiet save for the murmur of a kettle and the creak of the old clock on the wall. The scent of coffee drifted through the hall, warm and familiar. Amelia stepped lightly, unsure if she was allowed to be comfortable. She paused by the doorway of the main room. Elijah stood by the stove pouring water into a dented tin kettle. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows and his hair was still damp from the morning air. He wore a simple shirt and worn trousers. The sight of him was steadying, like the first ray of sunlight after a storm. He glanced toward her, eyes soft and unreadable. "Morning," he said simply. Amelia felt a flutter of something in her chest, fragile and warm. "Morning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You sleep all right?" he asked, turning to set the kettle on the small iron stove. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." She looked down at her hands. "Thank you. For everything." Elijah gave a small nod as though no thanks were needed. "Coffee'll be ready in a minute. There's bread on the table. Fresh enough, I think." Amelia stepped farther into the room. The wooden table near the fire was set with 2 mugs, a small loaf of bread and a jar of honey. Everything was simple, worn, but clean. She sat down, her fingers brushing over the grain of the table. It felt unfamiliar to sit somewhere without being told to move, to eat something without earning it through pain or silence. Elijah poured the dark liquid into 2 mugs and carried them to the table. He set one in front of her, then sat across from her. Steam rose from the cup, curling into the air. Amelia wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. Outside, the wind sighed through the fields. A horse neighed somewhere near the barn. The world was waking up. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that wasn't heavy or cruel but soft, like the pause between heartbeats. Amelia took a sip of coffee. It was strong, bitter, but it warmed her all the way down. She watched Elijah slice the loaf of bread, his movements calm, unhurried. He pushed a piece toward her. She hesitated, then took it, spreading a little honey across the crust. You don't have to do anything today, Elijah said after a moment. Not unless you want to. You can rest. Amelia looked up at him. I want to help, she said quietly. I don't want to be a burden. Elijah's gaze softened. You're not a burden. She dropped her eyes, unsure how to answer that. No one had ever said those words to her before. After breakfast, Elijah stood and reached for his coat. I've got to check on the horses, patch a fence that came loose in the storm. If you'd like to come, you can. Amelia hesitated only a second before nodding. She followed him outside. The air was crisp and the grass glistened with rain. Mud pooled in small patches across the path leading to the barn, and every step squelched softly beneath their boots. The barn stood tall and weathered, its wood darkened by years of rain and sun. Inside, the horses shifted in their stalls, their warm breaths misting in the cool air. One of them, a chestnut mare with a white blaze on her forehead, whinnied softly when Elijah approached. This is Willow, Elijah said, rubbing the horse's neck. She's gentle. You can pet her if you like. Amelia stepped closer slowly, her hand shaking just a little. Willow sniffed her palm, then leaned gently into her touch. Amelia let her fingers trail through the horse's mane. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. The softness beneath her hand, the steady breathing of the mare, it was grounding. Real. You've got a calm way about you, Elijah said quietly. Amelia looked at him, startled. I don't think anyone's ever said that about me. Elijah's lips curved into a small smile. First time for everything. They spent the morning in the barn. Elijah lifted bales of hay, checked tack, and filled water buckets. Amelia swept the hay-strewn floor, careful and focused. At first she worked silently, afraid of doing something wrong, but Elijah's instructions were simple, and his tone was never harsh. Once, when she dropped a wooden bucket and flinched instinctively, Elijah paused. He didn't ask why she reacted that way. He only picked up the bucket, set it upright, and said, "No harm done." His voice held no judgment. By midday, the clouds had thinned, and sunlight peeked through, glinting off puddles in the yard. Elijah leaned against a fence post, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Amelia stood a few steps away, her hair pulled back, her cheeks flushed from work. You all right? Elijah asked. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It feels good to be useful. Elijah's eyes softened. You've always been useful, he said quietly. Maybe no one ever let you see it. Amelia felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know how to respond, so she looked out at the fields instead. The grass swayed gently under the touch of the breeze. Birds flitted between the fence posts. It was peaceful. They ate lunch on the porch. Bread, cheese, and a small jar of pickles. Simple but enough. Amelia sat on the top step, her knees drawn up while Elijah leaned against one of the porch beams. The sun had warmed the wood and the air no longer smelled like rain but like dust and sunlight. After they finished eating, Elijah spoke. You don't have to answer, but where were you headed before you came here? Amelia's chest tightened. She stared at her hands. Nowhere, she said softly. And everywhere. I just kept walking. Elijah nodded slowly as though he understood more than he said. She hesitated, then asked, Why are you alone out here? No family? He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady. Had a brother once. We built this place together. He didn't make it through the winter 2 years back. Fever took him fast. He looked out across the fields. Been just me since. Amelia looked at him differently then. Not as a savior, but as someone who knew loss. Someone who had stood in the quiet after grief and still chosen kindness. I'm sorry, she whispered. Elijah nodded once. Life takes, he said simply. Sometimes it gives too. The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm. Amelia helped mend a broken fence. Elijah showed her how to tie the wire, how to secure the posts. Their hands brushed once, accidentally. Amelia felt the warmth of his skin like a spark, but neither of them spoke of it. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky with strokes of orange and gold, Elijah leaned on the fence and watched the light fade. Amelia stood beside him. You did good today, he said. Her lips parted slightly in surprise. Thank you. He glanced at her, his eyes soft. You don't have to thank me for telling the truth. They walked back to the house as the first stars appeared. Inside, Elijah lit the lamps and stirred the soup he had left simmering on the stove. The warm smell of herbs and vegetables filled the air. They ate at the table, the fire crackling softly nearby. Amelia's shoulders began to relax in ways she didn't recognize. Her body was tired, but it was the kind of tired that came from work, not worry. After dinner, Elijah stood and picked up the empty dishes. Amelia rose too. "Let me help." He paused, then handed her a plate. "All right, thank you." They washed the dishes together in a basin of warm water. Their hands moved in quiet rhythm. When they finished, Elijah dried his hands on a worn cloth and looked at her. "You're safe here, Amelia," he said softly. "You don't have to rush. You don't have to prove anything." Her eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears away before they could fall. "What if I mess up?" she whispered. Elijah shook his head. "Then we fix it together." The clock in the corner chimed softly. Amelia looked toward the hallway, toward the room where she had slept. "Good night," she said quietly. Elijah smiled gently. "Good night." She walked down the hallway, the quilt draped over her arm. As she reached her room, she paused, her hand on the doorframe. She looked back. Elijah was still standing by the table, his eyes calm, watching her with quiet care. Amelia stepped inside the room and closed the door softly behind her. She sat on the bed, the sounds of the house settling around her, the wind outside, the flicker of firelight down the hall. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders and lay back. The words he had said echoed in her mind. "You're safe here." She didn't know if she believed them yet, but for the first time she wanted to. And as sleep slowly pulled her under, her heart whispered something she hadn't dared think before. Maybe. I don't have to be alone anymore. The days passed in a rhythm that felt almost magical to Amelia. Mornings were filled with the quiet sounds of the ranch waking up, the low nicker of horses, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional call of a bird perched on the fence. She would rise with the sun, the golden light spilling across the fields like a gentle promise, and wrap herself in the thick quilt she had come to cherish. The room at the end of the hall had become more than just a place to sleep. It was a haven, a small island of safety in a world that had always felt storm-tossed. Elijah was already up when she emerged, moving with his usual calm assurance. He would be in the kitchen, the faint aroma of brewing coffee and fresh bread filling the space, grounding her before the day began. Amelia had learned not to speak immediately upon entering the kitchen, letting the quiet settle between them like a delicate truce. She would pour herself a cup, take a sip, and then, as if by unspoken agreement, they would share breakfast. Today she found him kneeling by a fence post that had been loosened by last week's storm. His hands, steady and strong, worked with practiced precision, hammering the post into place and securing the wire. The sunlight caught on his damp hair, glinting in shades of brown and gold, and Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She turned away quickly, embarrassed by the flutter in her chest, but her eyes couldn't resist lingering for just a moment longer. "You're staring," Elijah said without looking up. His voice was calm, teasing just slightly but not mocking. Amelia's face burned. It's not like that," she stammered. He finally straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. "Sure," he said with a small knowing smile. "If you say so." The morning passed in quiet companionship. Amelia fed the horses, brushed their coats, and refilled the water troughs. Elijah repaired the fence lines, checked the barn, and mended tools with meticulous care. Sometimes their hands brushed while passing a bucket or securing a post, sending little jolts of warmth through her. She caught herself smiling more than she realized, and sometimes, for a heartbeat, she forgot that she had ever felt unwanted or unworthy. By midday, they paused to eat. Elijah had made a small meal, bread, cheese, and dried fruit. They sat on the porch, the sun warming their backs, the field stretching endlessly before them. Amelia broke a piece of bread and handed it to a horse that had wandered near, her fingers grazing its mane. "You've got a gentle touch," Elijah remarked. Watching her, Amelia looked down, uncertain how to respond. I don't usually get to do things like this," she murmured. "Not without being told I'm in the way." Elijah's gaze softened. "Then maybe you just haven't had the right place yet." She felt a lump rise in her throat. Those words carried weight she wasn't prepared for, a truth she had longed to hear but never allowed herself to hope for. After lunch, Elijah suggested they check the northern fence line. The path wound through the rolling fields, past groves of oak and clusters of wildflowers that had survived the storm. The sunlight dappled through the trees, casting intricate patterns on the ground. Amelia walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing against his as they passed the buckets and tools. Every touch was electric yet comforting, and it made her heart feel simultaneously heavy and light. As they reached the fence line, Elijah inspected the posts carefully. One in particular had shifted during the storm and would need more than a quick fix. Amelia knelt beside him, helping to hold the post steady while he measured and adjusted the wire. "You're learning fast," he said, his voice quiet. Amelia felt herself blush. I think I'm just trying not to mess it up," she replied. Elijah shook his head, a small, amused smile tugging at his lips. "No one's perfect," he said. "You're doing just fine." The sun climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the field. Amelia's hands were sore from the work, her arms streaked with dirt and sweat, but she didn't mind. For the first time in years, she felt useful, like she had a place in the world, and beside her Elijah worked silently, steady and patient, never rushing, never demanding, simply allowing her to find her rhythm alongside him. When they finished repairing the fence, they sat on the ground, backs against a large rock, catching their breath. The view stretched endlessly before them. Fields of green, the distant hills, the barn rising like a quiet sentinel over it all. Amelia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm her face. Elijah leaned back against the rock as well, stretching his arms behind his head. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" he said softly. Amelia opened her eyes and nodded. "It is," she admitted. I haven't felt like this in a long time." Elijah turned to look at her, his expression unreadable but kind. "It's all right to feel it now," he said. "You deserve it." She bit her lip, unsure how to respond. Those words had a power she wasn't prepared for. She wanted to speak, to explain that she hadn't felt deserving of anything in years, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply sat there, the silence between them filled with the gentle whisper of the wind and the distant lowing of the cattle. As afternoon turned to evening, the sky shifted to shades of pink and orange, and the temperature cooled. They walked back toward the house, carrying their tools and the quiet comfort of the day with them. Amelia's shoulders were tired, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Elijah's presence beside her was steady, a silent reassurance that she was no longer alone. Inside, they cleaned up and prepared a simple dinner together. Elijah stirred the soup while Amelia set the table, and they moved around each other with ease, the rhythm of their actions comfortable and familiar. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. They ate in silence for a while, the occasional comment about the weather or the farm filling the gaps. Amelia's eyes wandered to Elijah now and then, noticing the way the firelight danced across his features, the quiet strength in his hands as he handled the dishes, the calmness in his eyes. She found herself studying him, not out of curiosity, but out of a growing admiration and a sense of safety she hadn't known she could feel. After dinner, Elijah cleaned the dishes while Amelia dried them. Their hands brushed occasionally, and each time a small jolt of warmth traveled through her. She tried not to notice it, but she couldn't help it. Her heart was learning a new rhythm, one that included someone else, someone who cared, someone who saw her worth even when she couldn't see it herself. When the chores were finished, they sat by the fire again. Elijah poured 2 mugs of coffee, and Amelia wrapped her hands around the warmth. She watched the flames flicker, lost in thought. "You've come a long way since that first night," Elijah said softly, breaking the silence. Amelia looked up at him, a small, uncertain smile on her lips. I feel different," she admitted. I've never felt like I belonged anywhere." Elijah nodded. "Sometimes it takes a while to find where we fit," he said. "And sometimes it takes the right people to help us see it." Her throat tightened. She had spent so long feeling invisible, unworthy, abandoned. But here with him, with the quiet warmth of the ranch, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a place. The evening stretched on, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. Amelia felt a sense of calm she hadn't known she could feel. She looked at Elijah, who was tending the fire now, and felt a surge of gratitude, not just for his kindness, but for his patience, his steadiness, and his quiet belief in her. The night deepened, and Elijah stood, stretching. "You should get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow is another day." Amelia nodded, feeling a small pang of reluctance. She didn't want the day to end, didn't want to leave this sense of peace, but she knew he was right. She needed rest, needed to let the calm settle into her bones. She stood, the quilt around her shoulders, and walked toward her room. Elijah followed, pausing at the doorway. "Good night, Amelia," he said softly. "Good night," she whispered, her heart still fluttering from the warmth of the day and the gentle weight of his words. As she lay in her bed, listening to the soft crackle of the fire down the hall, she reflected on the day. She had laughed a little quietly, but it had been genuine. She had worked not out of obligation, but out of a desire to belong, to be part of something, and for the first time in a long time she had felt hope. She pulled the quilt tighter around her, feeling its warmth seep into her, and closed her eyes. The memory of Elijah's words echoed softly in her mind. "Sometimes, it takes the right people to help us see where we fit," her heart whispered. Fragile knew that maybe, just maybe, she had found one of those people. The dawn came slowly over the ranch, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. The mist lingered over the fields, curling like ghostly ribbons above the damp grass. Amelia lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sighing of the wind through the trees. Last night's peace had wrapped around her like a fragile shield, but now the weight of reality pressed back in. A letter rested on the nightstand, its edges crisp, the paper still heavy with the scent of ink and authority. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She had avoided opening it for 2 days, fearing the contents, but the pressure in her chest made it impossible to delay any longer. With a shaky breath, she unfolded the paper and read. The words were sharp and cold, penned by the family who had abandoned her, a reminder of all the years she had spent feeling unwanted. They demanded she return to face judgment, that she leave the ranch immediately, and that she remember the mistakes they claimed she had made. The ink seemed to burn into her skin as she read. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the words. She crumpled the letter in her hands, standing abruptly. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of expectations, threats, and the life she thought she had left behind. Her breath came in shallow, quick bursts. She felt trapped, as if the world she had started to embrace, the warmth, the quiet safety, was slipping through her fingers. Elijah appeared in the doorway, sensing her turmoil without being told. His dark hair was mussed from sleep, his coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. He stopped when he saw the letter in her hands, his expression calm but alert. "They're asking you to leave," he said quietly, his voice steady, careful. Amelia's lips trembled. I don't belong anywhere," she whispered. "Not with them, not here. I don't belong." Elijah stepped closer, his eyes soft, unwavering. "Belonging isn't something others give you," he said gently. "It's something you choose. And if you choose to stay, then you belong here. With me, with the ranch, with this place you've started to call home." She shook her head, tears falling freely now. "But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail? What if I ruin everything?" Elijah reached out and took her hands in his, warm and steady. "You've already proven your strength," he said. "You've faced storms, you've faced fear, and you've still stood. You may not see it, but I do. I've seen it in every choice you've made since you came here. You are not fragile, Amelia. You are capable, and you are worthy." Her breath hitched. She had never be... "I know," she whispered. "That's why I'm staying." Relief, gratitude, and something warmer, a spark of love, shone in his eyes. He reached out, taking her hand in his, and for the first time Amelia didn't flinch. She intertwined her fingers with his, holding on, not out of fear, but out of choice. Together, they walked toward the porch, toward the rising sun, toward the fields that had become a sanctuary for her heart. The wind carried the scent of wet grass, wildflowers, and freedom. Every step she took was a declaration, a defiance against the past, against fear, against those who had tried to tell her she was worthless. The day unfolded like a blessing. Elijah showed her how to check the water troughs, repair a loose barn door, and feed the cattle. They moved together seamlessly, the unspoken rhythm of trust and companionship guiding their actions. Amelia realized that belonging wasn't just about a place, it was about people. It was about those who saw your worth even when you couldn't see it yourself. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky with streaks of pink and amber, Elijah suggested they sit by the fence and watch the fields. They leaned against the wooden boards, hands brushing occasionally, and for the first time Amelia allowed herself to feel completely at peace. "I never thought I'd feel safe," she whispered. You've earned it, Elijah said. And I'll do everything I can to keep you here, to keep you safe. Amelia turned to him, her heart swelling with emotion. I don't know what I would have done without you, she admitted. You didn't have to do it alone, he said. And you won't ever have to. The stars began to twinkle above them one by one as night settled over the ranch. The fireflies danced in the fields, tiny sparks illuminating the darkness. Amelia rested her head on Elijah's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. She realized that this was more than safety. It was love, gentle and unwavering, the kind that healed the deepest wounds. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them grew. Amelia became confident in her work on the ranch, tending the horses, repairing fences, and caring for the land with a newfound sense of purpose. Elijah was always nearby, guiding her, supporting her, and giving her the freedom to grow. But it wasn't just work. They shared quiet evenings by the fire, soft laughter, and the comfort of being seen for who they truly were. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the fields in gold, Amelia and Elijah walked to the edge of the pasture. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude and love. You showed me something I never believed I deserved, she whispered. A chance at happiness. A place where I belong. Elijah took her hands in his, holding them firmly. You belong wherever you choose to be, Amelia. And I choose you. Every day, her breath caught. The weight of the past, the fear, the abandonment, the whispered doubts, seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his gaze. She realized that she had finally come home, not just to a place, but to someone who truly loved her, someone who saw her worth even when she couldn't see it herself. As they stood there, hand in hand, the last light of the sun kissed the horizon. Amelia felt a sense of completeness she had never known. She whispered softly, Then I choose to stay. Elijah smiled, pulling her close. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. The stars above winked into existence, and the ranch stretched endlessly before them, a world full of promise and hope. In that moment, Amelia understood that belonging wasn't given, it was chosen. And for the first time in her life, she had chosen herself, and someone who loved her without condition. She had faced the storm, embraced her worth, and found love in the quiet, steady hands of the man who had never let her feel alone. And so, as the night settled over the ranch with fireflies dancing like tiny stars in the fields, Amelia and Elijah stood together, hearts intertwined, ready to face whatever came next, not as lost souls, but as two people who had finally found home in each other. The past had been harsh, the storms fierce and the whispers of doubt loud. But now, in the golden glow of possibility and the warmth of shared love, Amelia knew one undeniable truth: she was worth everything. And at last, she was finally free to be herself. The morning sun rose over the ranch in a quiet blaze of gold, spilling light across the fields that stretched endlessly beyond the barn. Amelia awoke to the sound of birds singing, a melody so gentle it made her heart ache with a strange mixture of joy and gratitude. She lay for a moment wrapped in her quilt, listening to the familiar rhythms of the ranch, the low nicker of horses, the soft creak of the porch as the wind shifted, the distant rustle of leaves. Everything felt real, solid, and alive, and yet she could hardly believe it was hers to hold. Elijah was already up, his figure framed by the open doorway of the kitchen. The sunlight caught the angles of his face, highlighting the quiet strength in his features. He looked over his shoulder as she emerged from her room, offering her a small, gentle smile that made her heart skip. "Morning," he said. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that carried a certainty she had spent so long searching for. "Morning," she whispered back. The words felt foreign and delicate, as though she were learning to speak them for the first time. She watched him move around the kitchen with ease, preparing coffee in the old iron pot, arranging slices of bread and cheese on a plate. Everything he did was simple, but it held a quiet purpose. Even in the ordinary, he created a sense of stability she had never known. They ate in silence for a while, sipping coffee and breaking bread, letting the peaceful rhythm of morning settle around them. Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she poured the last of the coffee into her mug. She glanced up at Elijah, feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. Today was different. Today she had made a choice she could no longer delay. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. her voice barely carrying over the soft hum of the kitchen. Elijah looked at her, his eyes attentive. "Of course," he said gently. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Amelia drew in a deep breath, holding it as though she could steady herself with its weight. "It's about the letter," she said, her fingers tightening around her mug. "The one from them, my family. I've been thinking, and I know what I need to do." Elijah set his mug down, leaning against the counter. His expression was calm, encouraging, but Amelia could see the underlying tension, the worry that he felt for her. "Go on," he said softly. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice stronger now. "I've spent my whole life believing I had to answer to them, that I had to prove I was worth something to people who never cared. But here, with you, I've learned that I am worth something, that I belong somewhere, and that somewhere is here." Elijah's chest rose and fell with a slow, steady rhythm. He reached out, placing a hand over hers. "Amelia," he said gently, "I've hoped you'd come to this realization, but hearing it, it's more than I could have wished for. You belong here, yes, but more importantly, you belong to yourself. That's what matters." Her eyes filled with tears, hot and unrelenting, but they were tears of release rather than sorrow. She had carried so much of the past with her, so much fear and doubt, and now it seemed to crumble in the warmth of this moment. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead lightly against his chest, letting the steady beat of his heart remind her that she was no longer alone. They spent the morning walking through the fields, the grass wet with dew, each step a declaration of Amelia's newfound freedom. She tended to the horses, brushing their coats with a careful hand, whispering softly to them as though their ears were the only safe place in the world. Elijah followed, observing her with pride and quiet awe. "You've grown so much," he said as they paused near a foal, its legs wobbling as it explored the pasture. "It's incredible to see you like this, strong, capable, and alive." Amelia smiled, a small, uncertain curve of her lips that soon broadened into laughter. "I feel alive," she admitted. "I've never felt this way before. I didn't think I could. Not after everything." Elijah knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's because you chose to let yourself feel," he said softly. "You let yourself belong, and that courage, that's what makes you alive." The hours passed, each moment steeped in the quiet intimacy of shared work and gentle conversation. Amelia felt the warmth of belonging wrap around her, not just as a temporary comfort, but as a permanent part of her life. She realized that the ranch had become more than a refuge. It was a place where she could grow, where she could thrive, where she could love without fear. As the sun dipped low toward the horizon, painting the fields in shades of amber and rose, Elijah suggested they rest by the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture. They sat on the soft grass, the wind rustling through the leaves, the distant mountains standing as silent witnesses to the unfolding peace. "You've changed everything for me," Amelia said after a long silence, her voice trembling with emotion. "You showed me that I'm not worthless, that I can be more than the pain I've carried." Elijah took her hand in his, holding it firmly. "No, Amelia, you changed yourself. I only showed you what you already had inside. You found your strength, your worth, your courage, and I'll be here, every step of the way, to remind you of it whenever you forget." Her heart swelled with a combination of love and gratitude that made it ache in the most beautiful way. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body ag. The night descended fully, wrapping the ranch in a blanket of quiet and stars. Amelia and Elijah sat together, hearts intertwined, watching fireflies dance in the fields, the world around them alive and full of promise. In that moment, Amelia understood something she had never truly believed before, that belonging, safety, and love were not given by the world. They were chosen, nurtured, and protected. And she had chosen them, and them had chosen her. She realized, with a profound sense of clarity and peace, that the storms of her past, abandonment, fear, self-doubt, had shaped her, yes, but they had not defined her. She was no longer the girl who whispered, "I'm not worth anything." She was a woman who had faced her fears, embraced her worth, and found love in its purest, most unwavering form. Elijah held her close as the first stars twinkled above. The ranch, the fields, the horses, the soft hum of the night, all of it was hers now to protect, to nurture, and to love. She whispered softly into the quiet, "I am worth everything. I'm worthy. I belong." And in that still, star-lit night, with the fireflies dancing and the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and earth, Amelia finally understood what it truly meant to be home. She had found it in the arms of someone who believed in her, in the land that had become her sanctuary, and in the quiet, unwavering knowledge that she had chosen a life filled with love, hope, and belonging. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely free.